Hello friends, my name is JJ, and as you may have heard, beloved animated rodent Mickey Mouse has recently entered the public domain. This means that his copyright has expired, and now anyone can make and sell any sort of Mickey Mouse-themed product they want without getting sued by Disney. Or does it? The other day, my artist pal Jeffrey designed this charming Mickey Mouse t-shirt and put it up for sale on TeePublic. Less than 48 hours later, TeePublic sent him a message saying that the shirt was being pulled from the site in response to a copyright complaint from Disney. Jeffrey responded swiftly, redesigning the shirt slightly and then reposting it. And Disney seems to be fine with this version, as they have submitted no further takedown notices, at least at the time of filming. So I think this whole episode is an interesting case study of what it means and doesn't mean for something to be in the public domain. The whole concept of public domain is one of the most important realms of law when it comes to American culture, and as all of the fun and confusion around the Mickey Mouse situation shows, it is also a realm of law that is only becoming more and more culturally relevant as the years go on. So today, I thought we would talk a bit about that. So to start, I have to note that I am not a lawyer, and thus no one should be using my descriptions of American public domain law as a substitution for actual legal advice. But that said, questions of what is or isn't public domain also tend to be relatively contested in court, and it is worth noting that there are a lot of theories about public domain out there that have yet to be fully tested or proven. Basically, a public domain is a legal concept that says a copyright cannot last forever. Copyright is literally the right to copy. And when it comes to creative works like movies and TV shows and books and video games, we give the exclusive right to make copies to the original creator, but only for a fixed period of time. When the term of copyright expires, the original creator loses his exclusivity rights, and from then on, anyone can reproduce both the original piece of media and the characters and stories contained within it. In the United States, copyright is a right guaranteed by Section 8 of the Constitution, which declares, "Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries." The key word there is limited. The traditional Anglo-American understanding of copyright holds that while granting exclusive right of reproduction to a creator is an important market incentive in the short term, in the long term, we want ideas to become the property of the people so they can be used in new and imaginative ways to advance the culture beyond the creator's original intent. However, that said, the US Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that the Congress's power to define those limited times are extremely broad and don't have to conform to any traditional understanding of the word limited. In 2012, they even ruled that things can be taken out of the public domain and put back under copyright if Congress comes up with a system for doing that. According to the US Copyright Office, under current law, the copyright of a creative work owned by a corporation, which is to say most of the creative works that anybody cares about, expires 95 years after it was released. So now that it is 2024, basically everything released before 1929 is in the public domain. There are some weird exceptions to this, however. There was a period of time in which the law said that you had to formally announce your copyright on your work in order for it to take effect, and then you had to manually renew that protection with the government every so often to keep it going. There are some works whose creators accidentally failed to do this and thus became public domain much earlier than they wanted. A classic example is the iconic zombie movie Night of the Living Dead. It was released in 1968, but accidentally failed to put a copyright notice in its credits, so it instantly became public domain. That claymation Rudolph cartoon from 1964 similarly had a typo in its copyright notice, so it automatically became public domain too. Some of the early Superman cartoons from the 1940s failed to have their copyrights manually renewed for whatever reason and became public domain as well, which is why you might have seen them being sold in cheap DVD collections in the Walmart bargain bin. But most rights holders were more attentive, which is why Public Domain Day, also known as January 1st, is such a big deal to public domain fans. Outfits like Duke University's Center for the Study of Public Domain now keep a watchful eye on the copyright terms of all manner of books and movies and music in order to let everyone know what has freshly entered into the public domain every time the calendar clicks over. I feel like the most obvious way that people take advantage of the public domain is in the book publishing world. Go to any bookstore and you will often see really cheap reprints of famous novels from the 19th century published by no-name companies looking to make a quick buck. The children's book industry is particularly fond of the public domain and have gotten a lot of mileage out of endlessly republishing stories like Alice in Wonderland or The Wizard of Oz, whose copyrights expired ages ago. Speaking of children, this also seems to be where public domain music thrives the most. Kids don't have particularly discriminating musical tastes, so children's entertainers have long realized that rather than spend a lot of time and effort writing a bunch of unique songs, they can just throw together a bunch of Victorian-era nursery rhymes and call it a day. All the great works of classical music are in the public domain as well, which is why they are so often heard in low-budget cartoons and video games. I actually made a whole award-winning video about the 90s-era British video game Lemmings, and it's almost entirely public domain soundtrack. But the dominance of books and music in public domain culture is also a reflection of the fact that up until now, very few movies with sound have been in the public domain. 1927 is usually held up as the end of the silent film era, with the notorious Al Jolson film The Jazz Singer marking the symbolic start of movies with synchronized audio. In another time, the 2020s would have thus marked the beginning of a golden age of cheap DVDs of newly public domain films. But given people don't really watch DVDs anymore, it probably just means we're going to start seeing a lot more full-length classic movies and cartoons uploaded to sites like YouTube with full monetization. Now, proving you own the copyright to something is an underrated part of keeping stuff out of the public domain. You may have heard that for a long time the song Happy Birthday to You was under copyright, which is why you didn't tend to hear it in TV shows or movies. That claim was challenged in 2015 and resulted in the song falling into the public domain after the purported owners were unable to prove their copyright in court. This is also the reason why Nintendo was able to create a character called Donkey Kong, who is so obviously a ripoff of King Kong. Universal Studios sued them, but failed to prove their ownership of the King Kong character, who Nintendo successfully demonstrated had fallen into the public domain. Sometimes you have the opposite situation as well, where something goes into de facto public domain because the copyright holder just doesn't care to enforce their rights for one reason or another. For example, a weird hobby that I have is collecting these little self-published pamphlets of Canadian political commentary from the 1970s and 80s. In the pre-internet age, circulating little pamphlets like these was a popular way for activists to spread their opinions, often very weird or eccentric ones. Now, these are not formally in the public domain. In Canada, copyright is always fixed to the death date of someone who has been officially recorded as the creator. And even if the people who wrote these things are dead, they haven't been dead for the 70 years that Canadian law requires for copyright to expire. But it is also almost certainly true that a lot of the family members of these obscure authors don't care enough to go around actually enforcing the copyright of their dead crackpot uncle or whatever. And this sort of situation can lead to what the lawyers call an orphan work, in which it is incredibly difficult to tell who, if anyone, would have the legal standing to sue me if, say, I decided I wanted to go around selling an unauthorized, republished 2024 edition of the Viet Cong front in Quebec. But it would still be risky because you never know for sure when someone might emerge from the woodwork. Given that most works of culture are self-published, unpopular, and largely unknown, the Center for the Study of Public Domain estimates that orphan works probably comprise the majority of 20th century culture. They advocate creating some sort of clear bureaucratic procedure wherein the government can formally declare orphan works to be part of the public domain after some reasonable but unsuccessful search to contact the copyright holder has been made. Okay, so in my opinion, the coolest most culturally relevant aspect of stuff passing into the public domain has less to do with the works of media themselves than the concepts contained within them. Because you see, when a creative work enters into the public domain, so do all of the component parts of that creative work, including the story, the characters, the setting, usually the music, and so on. Well, sometimes. Kind of. This is actually where things start to get sticky, and this is what caused all of that trouble for my friend. You see, Mickey Mouse made his public debut in the 1928 cartoon Steamboat Willie, and given that that cartoon is now in the public domain, so is the character of Mickey Mouse. However, US law also grants copyright protection to what are called increments of expression in derivative works, which is to say, if a copyright holder has made multiple works featuring the same characters or setting or storyline, and those characters or setting or storyline change over time, then those changed versions enjoy unique copyright protection independent of the public domain status of the versions that appeared in the original. Hopefully that makes sense. The estate of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, has been particularly litigious about this, and a lot of their lawsuits have helped clarify this realm of law. Back in 2013, for example, Random House was trying to sell an anthology of Sherlock Holmes fan fiction, and the Conan Doyle estate sued them, saying that some of the stories in that anthology involved aspects of the Sherlock Holmes universe that hadn't become public domain yet. And the courts agreed. There were a bunch of different Sherlock Holmes novels published in the United States between 1890 and 1927, so the courts ruled that if Random House wanted to sell fan fiction about Sherlock Holmes, it could only depict the Sherlock Holmes characters as they existed in the most recent books to pass into the public domain, which at that time was any book published before 1923. The 10 Holmes-Watson stories in which copyright persists are derivative from the earlier stories, so only original elements added in the later stories remain protected, said the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Thus, if we apply this test to Mickey Mouse, it is really only the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey that has entered into the public domain. Presumably, this is why Jeff's original shirt, which featured a more modern, full-color version of Mickey, got flagged, but the other one, which explicitly tried to make him look as much as possible like he did in the original 1928 cartoon, did not. In the 2013 Sherlock Holmes case, the Conan Doyle people held up the fact that Holmes didn't like dogs until near the end of the book series, as an example of a late-stage character development that wasn't part of his public domain persona circa 2013. People have accordingly speculated that based on how he behaves in Steamboat Willie, the idea that Mickey Mouse is a heroic and friendly character instead of just a sadistic animal abuser is probably still protected by copyright as of now. A similar but distinct challenge for using public domain characters involves the question of unique depictions. For example, if I were to ask you to close your eyes and imagine what Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, Frankenstein, and Peter Pan look like, you would probably imagine characters that look something like this. Well, to quote my old friend Scott Kramer, how dare you? Dorothy, Frankenstein, and Peter Pan are all public domain characters, given the books they appeared in are over 100 years old. But, as we all know, those books were also made into very successful movies by large Hollywood studios, and the creators of these movies came up with their own ideas of how these characters should look, given their physical appearances were barely described in the original text. This makes these distinctive looks copyrightable, even though the characters themselves aren't, in an example of what the courts would recognize as a unique increment of expression from a derivative work. As a result, if we wanted to make a Peter Pan or Dorothy or Frankenstein doll or t-shirt or Halloween costume, we would have to depict those characters in our own unique way that bears no resemblance to the versions created by MGM, Disney, or Universal. This is why if you've ever seen a kid's book based on some public domain story that also happens to have a famous movie or cartoon, you will notice that the characters will often be drawn in an awkwardly boring style that goes out of its way to not resemble their more well-known depictions, or at least get as close to the line as possible while maintaining plausible deniability. In practice, this ability to copyright unique derivative versions of otherwise uncopyrightable characters can give companies a sort of de facto control over them, given it can be hard to effectively market a depiction of a famous character who doesn't look like we expect them to look. An example would be that when Disney made their own terrible Wizard of Oz movie in 1985, they had to buy the rights to put Dorothy in ruby slippers from MGM. There are no ruby slippers in the original Wizard of Oz book. They just made that up for the MGM movie. But because the MGM movie is the only version of the Wizard of Oz that most people are familiar with, Disney worried that audiences would be confused and distracted by any version of Dorothy that didn't have the ruby slippers. So, I would say that I'm a pretty big fan of public domain overall. I respect the needs of creators to be fairly compensated during the initial release of their works, but decades later, I also think it's cool for the public to be able to use those works for new things. One thing that I've come to appreciate in making as many videos about American culture as I have is just how recent so much of modern American culture is, often less than 100 years old, and what a pivotal role big corporations have played in the building of that culture. Big corporations are, of course, easy to demonize, but it can't be denied that their wealth and resources have been essential in making some of the most ambitious and innovative cultural works of the last century possible. That said, I think that most of us also don't want culture to be managed and gate-kept by large corporations forever, and as more and more 20th century copyrights begin to expire, we are thus entering into an exciting new era in which stuff like classic cartoon characters and golden age Hollywood movies are starting to become more like fairy tales or folklore, in the sense of being part of the shared cultural property of all Americans. But like I said earlier, this setup is also fragile and does depend a lot on the US government choosing to respect this emerging tradition and not pass any new laws that could send the progress backwards. So let's all keep an eye on that. Anyway, I'm curious if you have any fun or interesting stories or examples of public domain culture. I am sure I have only skimmed the surface with some of the examples in this video. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.